So we're here for another sculpture forum. I'm Garth Evans, and I am here with
Brandt Junceau, sculptor.
Choghakate Kazarian, art historian and curator.
Jock, Ireland, sculptor, teacher.
And with Maud Bryt behind the camera as usual. And we have been looking at an exhibition in the Centre for Contemporary Italian Art, a beautiful place downtown, an exhibition of figures by the Italian sculptor Marino Marini. And someone would tell me these figures were made between 1932 and 1949, I believe. When I was a student back in the late 1950s, can you believe it? There were three Italian sculptors that we kind of were very aware of and paid some attention to: Marino Marini, Giacomo Manzu, and Emilio Greco. I have to say that as a kind of callow youth, I didn't think highly of any of them at the time. And I was not aware really of this body of work that we've been looking at, of figures. I was aware really primarily of his horses and figures on horses, which I think is probably the better known work that Marino produced. And I was really, I must say, although this work is very, classical, mostly standing nude female figures, and in some ways the kind of thing that I would think is going to be predictable and a little boring. I was actually quite moved by it. I have to admit, it was really touched me in some place, and I'll, in the course of this conversation, try and figure out exactly where it touched me. Somebody else.
I was touched too, and it is a challenge to figure out why. And I've been thinking about it. I've been able to see the show for a few months ago, and one of the things that occurred to me was I thought of the standing figure that we, or some of us saw at the Frick in January, the St. Jerome. Uh-huh. And the sense in which that figure was typical of many Renaissance figures, and typical in that there was some shame associated with the body in that figure. Mm-hmm. And there's something about all of the female figures, really about all of Marino's figures, that there's a kind of innocence, a lack of shame. That is sort of unusual in all of, or much of, the Western figure sculpture that I'm familiar with, and that it seems to me is a sort of an identifiable thing to hold on to. Many of the figures are called pomonas, and the pomona figure in mythology is not a it's out of Ovid. It's not. It's a Roman sort of. Shallow is the wrong word, but it's a figure that lacks the kind of tragic dimension of Greek figures, and not Persephone, not Demeter. That it's there's an innocence, but a real innocence, an innocence that is touching, moving.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We'll have to come back to that. Innocence. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think the sense of presence was what I felt, you know, and it was not. It didn't strike me as a psychological presence, but a physical presence.
Right, it's the lack of shame about the body. The body is present because of that. It believes in itself. It's and it's unembarrassed.
Yeah. Brandt.
I think Jock's really onto something. I can't think of another exhibition or another artist's work where I was really aware of the simple matter of dress or undress and nakedness and exposure. And it was present in every one of those pieces as if they were living things. That whether they were dressed, undressed, semi-dressed, who might look at them was in everything about the figure. And it went all the way back to the little Venus of Willendorf. I thought, it was there too. And as far as like how I'm touched, it's interesting to me because I've been looking out for Marini wherever I could see him, thinking about him, and usually if I've given this much thought and had this attraction and interest in a subject, I generally have kind of a sense of that person. And Marini for me is still an incomplete thing, which I think is part of the attraction. He somehow has this wonderful seriousness. It almost leaves him out in a way. Of course he must be so present, and yet, exactly where he comes from, exactly what he says is still an open question to me.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'm not going to disagree with you, but I mean, most kind of classical nudes don't convey a sense of shame. One of the things that I've found very surprising in many of these works was a kind of sense of humor, that touch of, there was, not out loud laugh, but there was a sense of maybe delight is a better word, humor, some kind of I can't find the right word, not pleasure, but I guess I felt a sense of joy.
There is clearly a smile in these figures. I mean, not necessarily a smile on the face, but as if the entire body was smiling. But at the same time, I feel a lot of modesty in these nudes. They're not offering themselves either. And I was thinking about the figure of Pomona, and also how Mayol interpreted Pomona earlier, I think it was in 1910, with her hands offering something and offering herself. But with Marini, these Pomonas, they're not offering anything or themselves. Their hands and arms are closed and very close to their own bodies, and sometimes they don't even have arms, or very small arms, and they're close to their own bodies. And it's the second time I was seeing the exhibition, and I think the first time I was very much attracted to the volume of these bodies, and looking at them the second time, I was very fascinated by the surface. It's all about the surface. It's very surprising how he treated this, almost as if these objects were digged from an archaeological soil, and as several times he kept the residue of the cast, so we feel like they have been digged out of something, uncovered them, and there is a residue of that material that is still there. They're not pure, their surface is not sleek, and we have all sorts of residues, I mean, in terms of material, the scratches he made on them.
Yeah, all of that's true, but they're not about the surface. I mean, I think you touched on, Choghakate, one of the things that I wanted to get to, which is I was enthralled really by the forms, these shapes that these figures are made up from are the way they hover between a kind of pure a pure form, pure geometric form, and a fleshy, full, bodily sense of something pulsing, and never quite settling one way or the other. I mean, and especially, I mean, like you'd look at this figure, and from one point of view, it would seem, very. I guess meaty, and from another point of view, or a slightly different aspect, maybe around the back a little, it would become pure form, completely abstract. You couldn't even recognize it as the back of a figure. That was the thing that really kind of got me involved, was this sense of being confronted by something that was a figure, and that was, flesh and bone, or spoke about flesh and bone, and at the same time, held that presence, and at the same time became, ethereal in another way.
I don't know if I really see bones in these bodies. I have the feeling that they're envelopes, they're full, but I don't have the feeling of flesh and bones. For me, they're pure envelopes, and I think also very frequently when, especially in the figures where without arms, where we can literally see through them, through this hollow cast, I feel like they're really envelopes, and I have very much that feeling, and probably somehow enhanced by how he treated the feet of these women, which are very peculiar, I think.
Well, very varied. The feet were very varied, but I mean, I agree with you. I mean, but that time, what I'm saying, in a way that because of what is represented, you could not be unaware that you were looking at something that was supported by bone and muscle and fat, and was fleshy. You couldn't, because of what's represented and the way it's represented. At the same time, these things offered themselves as something very abstract. And you reference an envelope. I mean, a pure form of some kind, and the way in which they managed to be both those things was what I really kind of got myself fascinated by. I mean, the way in which something can be more than one thing at the same time.
And the scratches on the surface and broken arms and whatnot, there's a sense of the figures being in process. The work hasn't been finished, and the feet, some of them the clay is dried, and he's just left it. And also the spontaneity with which the parts are put together. They sort of just happen right in front of your face.
Yeah, in some cases, yes, all of that. I mean, the way his presence as the maker was available was also in many figures. I mean, unlike say Mayol, where he's totally kind of polished the thing down to the last Yeah, these were not like that, and as you say, there were a lot of surface activity, a lot of scratching, and I mean, yeah, that was fascinating too, wasn't it? Like some kind of
On that scratching thing, they often seem to me almost as if they were found in a way, like pre-existent. And although the artist has made the thing from scratch, it's as if he's working with something that's always been there, and he barely touches it. He nudges it a bit. He kind of scratches his name, scratches a feature, almost like graffiti, almost like a small vandalism, a tender vandalism. And you have the sense that this thing has always been there, and that it always will be, that it's permanent, that it's somehow like it's just under our feet all the time.
Well, I mean, I mean, yes, in the sense of the subject matter always being there, and and what have you. But I did not think the objects, the physical objects, were things that felt. I mean, they felt found in the sense of discovered, through a process of mostly modelling, and not preconceived in except in the most kind of basic terms. But they didn't speak to me of things dug out of the ground.
There's nothing academic about them, nothing antiquarian. They often have a kind of like, it's not like an antique look, but like an old soul kind of feeling. Mm-hmm. And that bit of like the white ludo that clings to some of the bronze castings, it is as if they've been excavated, but they've been excavated from the mold. They're entirely of a moment. I mean, it's the latest one was 49, but it felt like they were somewhere into the 60s, into the 70s, and it could just be, today.
I agree with you with these surfaces. Like, it's as if it has always been there, like they have been found like this. And you mentioned the graffiti. I was absolutely thinking about that, because the scratches, they don't mean anything in terms of representation. It's just that as an act of vandalism, and somehow I was thinking of Lucio Fontana, who is from the same generation, but who would use this language of the graffito on his terracotta, or also on canvas, just trying to just scratch the surface. And somehow I believe that's also probably the same spirit that inspired Twombly when he came to Italy and saw these graffitis in these ancient ruins on the surface of these works.
That's an interesting thing, thinking of Marini's scratching in terms of Twombly's.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we're using the word scratching, but they didn't. I mean, and I'm not sure how important it is, this kind of, because it was only on some works. In many cases, especially in the smaller figures, one had evidence of the tool marks, but not a deliberate and separate activity, as one did, well, in one figure in particular, in the far right-hand corner, where it was covered head to toe in some kind of almost like handwriting. And yeah, that was interesting. I mean, I never felt that it was a kind of scratching in the sense of like somebody scratching at an irritation, at an itch, but some other kind of activity which was almost erotic in a way,
That's interesting about the itch, because it makes me think of the grit in the oyster. that makes the pearl. It is as if there's some kind of nervous energy that just locates somewhere or climbs around the body.
Where the figures come from is interesting. And they don't evolve sort of purely out of a process. You could say Twombly's stuff exists only as scratches. These things come out of a dream, and a dream that didn't last. He started when he was young, but I think after 1949 he couldn't make another female nude. And that's significant, it seems to me. And I just happen to think of the choreographer Paul Taylor. He would make, his work can be divided into light dances and dark dances. And people would say that he made his light dances when he was very unhappy and miserable. And he made his dark dances when he was, everything was going just right. And that sense of these joyful, innocent figures coming out of, the turmoil of fascism, Second World War. They don't come out of a process, is what I'm trying to say. They're a dream, a song.
Well, it's a substantial body of work, isn't it? I mean, does someone know if what we were seeing in the galleries was kind of like the bulk of what he produced, or was just like a small sample of what he produced during that period?
I don't know the exact dates, but I think as the main point of the show was to go beyond the riders, because that's what he's most famous for. And also I think it's a very different paradigm, because the riders are more monumental in scale, also in purpose. They're more like really literally as monuments, and also with this figure of male riders that were outstretched. They were as if it was a cry. They're very dramatic and extroverted, and these nudes are more introverted. They're more modest and more melancholic, I believe. I don't know if it has to do also with the fact that several of these works were produced when he was in exile in Switzerland, where he went at the end of 1942, which is very strange, because at the beginning of the year he was appointed the professor at the Brera in Milan, but after the bombing of the city he decided to leave and go to Switzerland, where he also had a chance to meet with Giacometti, and who was born the same year as Marini. And speaking of Giacometti, I like the idea that they chose to put a painting and not a sculpture of him, because painting was so important for Giacometti. And I remember that in his writing he was telling that how much trouble he had with painting. He couldn't reach anything, and it was an ongoing process of scrambling and babbling on the canvas.
As to the magic that you mentioned, Jock, I think that's really perceptive. We should mention that little plaster replica is known to have been held by Marini while he was working at that time. So it's, when we look at practically any of these, we can imagine that he has that thing in one hand and is working with the other, which puts him like physically at the center of this circuit, back and forth from this magical little thing in a period, where belief was fact, and it's held by this modern skeptic who's living through this horrible uncertainty.
Well, that touches on the sense in which, I felt very strongly as a student making life-size figures, male and female nude figures. that it was a very strange thing to be doing, and that in some ways it represented an act of faith. And I'm not quite sure what I mean by that, but it was a belief in something. And I think this is one of the things that I felt looking at this work. It kind of took me back to that sense that I had as a student, that I was entering upon a kind of endeavor that really required one to have some kind of faith in humanity, in people. And I think that was one of the things that I was touched on by this work, was it took me back to that sense of aspiration that I had as a student, and and cling to today. But yeah, I mean, magic. I'm not sure Jock mentioned magic. He meant dream. A dream.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not troubled by magic, though I'm not troubled by magic. I haven't heard the story about his actually holding on to the
Me neither.
The Venus of Willendorf, but there's a picture of Bill Tucker holding on to that sculpture at famous, sort of, in quotes, famous.
Well, I think he actually got the original to the British Museum and had it in his hand and had it photographed.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. But we're in this moment, and we share it with Marini, where that Venus has a special kind of significance, whether it's entirely magical or is more kind of academic. But it's interesting to think about the significance of making a figure, and it had a certain kind of significance for you in the late 50s.
And like not to compare myself in any sense, but I couldn't keep doing it either. There was a point when it just became impossible to continue, making naked people.
Right, but that's the key thing. That's the difference between. These are not naked people. These are, if you want, magical. They're that sense of intangible, something intangible being at the heart of their presence. It's not, you were just in London and sent the photograph of that monstrous thing outside of the Tate.
Yeah.
And that Victorian sculpture is just making people with clay, and that's not
a lot more than that. I mean, there was a horse and there were all kinds of things. I mean,
whatnot.
but the whole thing was extremely erotic, you see. And I think you're right. You're absolutely right. These were not at all. So they hark back to a sense in which being without clothes is, as you started out saying, was not shameful. It was just it, And so that sense of being, I guess you said, innocent. Well, this touches on this is where, as a student at the Slade, I went there in 1957, and the ethos was one in which we had a sense that nature was most perfectly typified by a naked female, was abundant and was the source of all creativity, and this is where we were supposed to go, to the naked female, because that was, in some way to touch upon, the fundamental source of the generative power in the universe. God help us.
I think I was interested in what you said about being naked or not. When you enter the show and start looking at them, you don't think that they're figures who undressed at some point, as if they were eternal nudes who never were never dressed at all from the beginning. But when you look into details, several of these figures have details of clothes. Some of them have something that resembles shoes. Few of them have real hairstyle, and there are small details here and there, but with more humor than eroticism, I think, that somehow refer to a real person and clothes and being dressed at some point.
Yeah, it's that mix of contemporary, the contemporary world, and the sort of ideal classical form that there's none of the sort of contemporary world in a Mayol, and that is the sort of distinguishing, or one of the.
That's right. That's right.
Hardly any body sense in a Mayol.
No.
Yeah.
They're just art from art to art.
Right.
Well, I mean, but they they
smooth
have
pedal.
qualities that are quite wonderful. I mean, some of them, I mean, just in terms of the geometry of those Mayol figures. But yeah, no, and there was significant variety in these figures, I thought. I mean, while at the same time, just touching on what you said, I'm not sure that I kind of experienced them as personalities, as characters at all. But at the same time, there was a surprising variety of presences.
I would say they're personalities, but they're not portraits, for sure. But they have their own, each of them is somehow an individual, but without being a portrait.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting, I mean, now we're touching on it. I mean, it's an interest. I'm curious as to how they offered themselves as distinct and unique, each one. A particular individual thing one is confronted with, not a type, not a generalization, but a specific individual presence. At the same time, not a character, not a. One couldn't I couldn't anyway, begin to kind of say, oh, this is such and such a type of person. This is the person, if this person were to speak, they'd have a voice like this, and they'd sound like this, and they'd move like this, and they'd...
Yeah. But Brandt, in his piece for the rail, he brings in Susanna, and that was a surprise to me, and I'm not, well, it was a surprise to me. Susanna and the Elders, that.
A couple of the pieces are Susanna's.
Well, but they're not labeled as Susanna.
Aren't they somewhere? I think there's one or two of them.
Well, I sort of believe the connection.
Crouching.
Yeah, right, sure.
Yeah.
As I say, I believe the connection.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to, there are Susannas, and they're different from the Pomonas. And that sense of a particular character. But they're both sort of innocent. The Susanna and the Elder story has a happy ending. And the Pomona thing it's not about, it's lacking the kind of tragic dimension of a lot of Greek myths, stories.
It's quite a neutral character. I mean, Pomona is probably one of the mythological characters with the less stories, and it's basically a vague and neutral representation of female body, and with all his juices and flesh and plentiness.
Yeah.
There's basically no story behind it.
Exactly. But I mean, we, or at least some of us, know Bruce Gagne's sculpture, and looking at this through Bruce's work, this is innocence, purity. It's and Bruce engages with a kind of complexity, a kind of darkness,
I don't know if I would call it innocence, but for sure it's not the eroticism and the erotic complexity of a Venus.
Yeah.
It's Pomona, it's not Venus.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
Pomona is more neutral in those terms than
Right.
Venus.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, though I think there was at least one that was
A
labeled.
Venus,
Yeah.
Yeah, at least
Yeah.
one. I think
Yeah.
maybe more than one.
but many of them were just Pomona or just female figures.
Yeah, right, right.
And somehow, I think, to go back to this archaeological aspect, they remind me of the works of Arturo Martini. And if I'm not wrong, I think he succeeded to Martini at the Monza Academy
Yeah.
as a professor. And they both have this kind of melancholia, which is so surprising because both of them participated in official monuments during the fascist era, which was supposed to glorify victory. But both of them employed this kind of melancholical individual aspect in their sculptures at the same time.
Yeah, but Marini is different from Martini.
Oh yes,
I
definitely.
didn't think they were melancholic,
Yeah,
these figures.
that's
No.
it.
I mean, if anything, they seem to me to be serene.
They are serene, yes, maybe
Yeah.
that's a better
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, and just alive. The sense of Martini being dead, you know.
Yeah, Martini is more about death, literally.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, but I think it
That's
is
true.
that sense of being both that these things felt, that it was as if one was in the presence of a living thing, and at the same time this thing was serene. That was a paradox. How can that possibly be? Serenity and life don't come together.
That's that complexity at the core of his character and his work, I think, that he's so kind of equable that these things, mutually contradictory, exclusive things, exist together, in his work. In him, he has some kind of poise where he can allow these things to exist, and each speaks softly for itself, and thereby has this complexity that I find attractive and sustaining.
It's simplicity, though. I don't see complexity. It's a moment that comes out of nowhere, and that's pure and simple.
Well, it was a period of years. It wasn't a moment. And I mean, it
Yeah.
is interesting that after what we said, 1949, he discontinued working with this as a subject.
Yeah. And he went, I'm not that familiar with his horses, but there are horses with riders that are pure and innocent. And then he sort of shifts into this thing. He tries to engage with tragedy and whatnot. And I think fumbles. As long as the riders are these sort of little boys with little erections, that they're in touch with this sort of erotic purity. When he starts,
Erotic purity.
well, yeah.
I like it.
There's a childlikeness that is different. He gets more conscious. He gets more aware of abstract sculpture that's going on in the 50s and 60s.
Not purely erotic purity.
Well, but that it's.
I love it.
Well, it's simple. It's not, complicated in the way that sort of Greek stories get complicated.
Yeah.
But I think it's that old soul, equable, kind of poised element in his character that lets things arrive simply, but can't help but include so much. And the horses, I mean, the horses are a nightmare.
Well,
They're like a strobe light in the darkness, and you see this flash, this scene of horror, which yet is like vital and, has this promise that somehow things can go on. It reminds me, like, to find a simile, the closing moments of Fellini's Nights of Cabiria, when she's had this terrible, terrible crushing blow to her self-love, to her, her connection to the world, and she said, I don't want to live, I don't want to live. And within a few minutes, she's walked into this group of people and something begins to sort of seep into her, and she's alive again, like, who knows, maybe more alive than ever. And I mean, I think like the horses are kind of like in that world where some of them, because at some point they become titled miracles, and you see this catastrophe and the figure is like thrown and somehow is like raising his arms.
Yeah.
And
I do think that he's, that attempt to get more complex.
There's great depth.
And it was genuine. I think he fumbles now and then, but that's okay with me. I'm not trying to dismiss the horses completely, but they do. Just the male-female thing is.
I mean I was, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I was only really aware of the horse and rider figures as a student, and I think I was somewhat intolerant of them, feeling that they aspired to a kind of drama that I was not sympathetic to. These, on the other hand, have nothing of that kind of sense of, they are. I mean, it's a question of subject matter, and somehow the horse and riders, and the subject matter, the story, begins to be, engaged in a way. Whereas here, there isn't a kind of, a sense of one. Touching on a lot of mythology and traditions and the whole. I mean, there's a kind of sense in which he was able to engage the tradition without it being a burden, and he didn't have to deal with it as such. Whereas later in life, it became something he had to deal with and had to find a way of, coming to terms with and escaping from, and it wasn't just something that was there and it was a given. Whereas here, it seems like he's not consciously thinking about, having to deal with the history of this subject.
Right.
And in that sense, I think they're innocent. Like, that somehow or other it's just a given. This is what we do, and this is my way of doing it. Yeah. And then at some point he couldn't.
Yeah.
But there's that question of why he couldn't.
I think
that there was a long
question.
Shadow, creeping into the picture.
Well, did he say anything? Do we know anything? Do you know anything about what did he say? I can't keep doing this because.
Yeah,
No, I would be curious to know about it.
Yeah, but I think it's just, I can't do it. I don't know why. I can't. I don't know why I started doing it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's.
Like waking from a dream.
Well, I think it's. My guess. I'm just projecting myself into that. It's a loss of belief. I can no longer believe in this.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means. What it is, what the this is that one is believing in, but the failure to be able to continue doing it is because somehow it doesn't become. It's become. You can't believe it anymore. You can't believe in it. You can't believe in its place in the world.
Yeah, and that is that's I think sort of something very important to think about. Or, I think not many people pay much attention to Marino Marini today, and they don't for complicated reasons. But one of the reasons is that sort of intangible. It's so difficult for us to explain why he stopped and what he was doing while he wasn't stopped.
Yes.
But it just occurred to me one day, thinking about Marino Marini and James Bond. James Bond is a guy on a horse. He had his fancy car, the man of action, and then there the Bond girls. And think about a Bond girl and these things. They're so just have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
But every our culture is about Bond girls, and this sort of precious moment is is strong enough, even though it's very fragile, to just James Bond goes out the window in that the fourth floor down on whatever it is, Broome Street or Grand Street.
Well, it touches on. It opens up a whole. Arena of discussion about. Here is a man making naked female figures, and we did have in this exhibition, a small de Kooning woman painting, and the way in which the de Kooning, came to that subject and represented that subject is, I think as Brandt kind of mentioned in his rail piece, is it's stark contrast to and I think it's to do with a sense in which, as a man at this point, he clearly de Kooning's women are threatening. These women, these figures are not threatening. To what extent was this his inability to continue a result in a huge kind of shift in gender roles after the Second World War.
But there is a deep connection, it seems to me, between the de Kooning and Marini, and that is the sort of unfinished look. The most of the de Kooning has been kind of flattened, in quotes, in the way that de Kooning resolves a de Kooning painting. But the right-hand side of that de Kooning is kind of open, kind of unfinished, incompletely resolved. And all of Marini's figures are, in this same sense, incomplete or unfinished. But it's that they're unfinished because they can't get hold of that idea the way I can get hold of Maud's glasses here, or a camera or something. It's an intangible, elusive idea, and it's as elusive. It's as elusive for de Kooning as it is for Marini.
De Kooning called it the glimpse.
Well, sure.
But I believe what you said about de Kooning's women being threatening. It's true that compared to Marini, who were more serene, and somehow I believe because de Kooning's women, they have a face that is very there, and that's the first thing you usually see, which is not the case with Marini, because the face is not the main thing, and some of these women don't even have a head. So it's very on the background, and what you see first with Marini is the belly and the breast, just very centralized in terms of where your eyes go. And with de Kooning, it's very much about the face, and it's more like a face as a mask with the Kooning. I don't know if the wilderness of the Kooning has probably more to do with the fact that his medium is painting and Marini has sculpture as a medium. And it reminds me of this important essay by Arturo Martini, Sculpture, Dead Language. And it's very beautiful somehow. I don't know if it's about his own failure or failure of sculpture in general. I mean, it's about sculpture in general, and how somehow he compares painting and sculpture, and somehow he says that painting is winning somehow because it had the ability to embrace contemporary life in its language, and sculpture couldn't do that. It's still a dead language, which is all about, well, death. But somehow it's true, because usually most of the time sculpture is traditionally used as a language of monuments, of commemoration, of tombs. And in a way, it's also literally a still language. And in a way, you proceed with painting in a different way, by addition, modifications, but it's a very different process with sculpture, although you can do alterations, but somehow the sculpture appears at once out of the cast, although there have been many stages before, but the final stage it's an apparition. I mean, it appears literally and in its final form, and it's there, it's solid. So probably there's this difference between these two paintings.
The de Kooning and Marini are really close in a way, though, because the de Kooning is like a graffiti.
Yes.
It's as if he establishes a muddled wall and scribbles, scratches, wipes it, smears it a little bit, and leaves this almost ghost image, which looks like the Venus of Willendorf. It's, goes from like knees to head, legs together,
That's true.
standing straight, arms.
In terms of the image, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, but with the Kooning, this graffiti-like language, it's how he defines and does the form. It's how he paints. With Marini, I feel like there's the construction of the form, this molding process, and then the graffiti is more an addition. With the Kooning, it's not an addition; it's inside. And with Marini, it's very strange to just, as a sculptor, just to think so much of the surface. And probably you can say more about the process of casting and the patina he uses with all this white that is so visible and so somehow dirty in a way. It's not a sleek surface. And I'm thinking also about a different generation of Italian sculptor, Adolfo Wild, who used to teach at the Brera, I think it was in the 1910 or 20s. And he was obsessed with sleek surfaces, these very smooth marble surfaces. And he did so much the contrary. And I'm very interested in how sculptors treat the surfaces, and especially with bronze, and in this cast process.
Yeah. But there are stories about Marini waking up in the middle of the night and in darkness going down to his studio and touching, thinking about the forms just with his hands, or very little light. And that the whole tactile dimension of a lot of modern sculpture, but certainly this, the forms come out of his hands, not his brain.
And his importance to Henry Moore is revealed through this exhibition in a way that I was very surprised by. It's a beautiful exhibition, and in a beautiful space, and beautifully lit, and really a joy.
Yeah,
really
miraculous.